This is Jack Stanley, and I want to talk about the Analytic Magazine. And the Analytic Magazine, which I have some copies here in bound form, was produced from 1813, January of 1813, up to about 1821. And it is a groundbreaking, very important, influential magazine that was made in Philadelphia. Actually, the address for its manufacture was 52 Chestnut Street, which was within the shadow of Independence Hall. And what's interesting about this magazine, I want to show you some stuff here. Fascinating, first off. The publisher was Moses Thomas, and he was born in 1787, and he died in 1865. He lived a pretty long life. The editor is an interesting fellow of note. His name was Washington Irving, and he was born in 1783 and died in 1859. And of course, you had another fellow that took off, basically taking care of all the stuff after Thomas left due to serious financial problems, and he was a Mr. Maxwell who was born in 1784 and died in 1845. Now, getting all that done, here is the first title page for the magazine. And this is the first issue, number 1, from January of 1813. You'll see the address and the publisher. It doesn't mention Washington Irving, but it's quite fascinating to see that they had set up this whole network of sales for the company. And I want to explain this to you if I can. Let me read the various areas that this magazine was available in January of 1813. It was available from Bradford and Collins in New York City, John C. Moore in Trenton, New Jersey, E.F. Backus in Albany, New York, Howe and DeForest in New Haven, Connecticut, Hale and Hosmer in Hartford, Connecticut, Charles Williams in Boston, Massachusetts, H. Whipple in Salem, Massachusetts, E.J. Cole in Baltimore, Maryland, M.R. Lockerman in Wilmington, Delaware, J. Wythe in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Wes Cooper and D. Rapine in Washington City, J. Milligan in Georgetown, J. Kennedy and Son in Alexandria, J. R. Jones in Richmond, Virginia, J. W. Campbell in Petersburg, Virginia, C. Bonzel in Norfolk, Seymour and Williams in Savannah, Georgia, Reynolds and Levy in New Orleans. A lot of places this was available. They did their work. They prepared things before they started. So you can be sure that for the January 1813 issue, which is here, and I have all of them, they were all bound. These are historically bound. These were originally bound in 1813, 1816, 1815. I have, as I said, about 36 different issues within these bounded pieces. They're quite early, quite rare, quite unusual. And what is really fascinating is what is in them. Because there's stories about history, there's stories about art, there's stories about theater, poetry, international affairs, and of course the war, and talking about various individuals. You realize in these books were the first mention, the first biography of John Paul Jones, the first use of the Star-Spangled Banner, the poem by Francis Scott Key, called Saving Fort McHenry. So many other fantastic and amazing articles. Temple Franklin wrote about his grandfather in here. And of course, Temple Franklin inherited all of his grandfather's books and took them to England, as a matter of fact. But what I find most fascinating is the fact that you name the topic of the time. It was here. I didn't see much about cooking, so I'll leave that alone. But just about everything else is in here. Now, a couple other things to mention to you. First off, these books were published from 1813 to 1820, and they were right in Philadelphia. And as I mentioned, they were within the shadows of Independence Hall. Now, Independence Hall, as we call it today, was the State House years ago. And it didn't look like it does today. It had kind of a short, squat tower in the front. And it had two wings with buildings in which eventually the Congress and the Senate would be. And, of course, other parts of it looked decidedly different. But in 1812, everything would change right when they were preparing to start this whole enterprise. And it's interesting to note, if you go to New York City, Federal Hall was torn down in 1812. How stupid. That's where George Washington was inaugurated. That's where the Congress and the Senate first met. That's where they voted on the Bill of Rights. And they tore it down. Yeah, there wasn't much there until the 1840s, and then they built a customs house, which they now call Federal Hall. But it has as much to do with Federal Hall as any other building built in a spot where a previous building once was. But of course, in Philadelphia, it was pretty bad too. Because in Philadelphia, right down from where these were pressed, 52 Chestnut, was Franklin Court. And in 1812, the Franklin family tore down Benjamin Franklin's house. They destroyed it. What did they put in its place? Low-cost housing, a housing development. And we lost all that history. Not to be outdone by it all, let's go back to Independence Hall. In Independence Hall in 1812, they were gutting parts of it. They tore down both of the wings in which the Senate and Congress had met, where George Washington was inaugurated for his second term, where John Adams was inaugurated for his first and only term. On the other side was governmental buildings. They tore those down too. And then rebuilt buildings of a very different style in their place. Eventually, they would tear down the tower that was in front of Independence Hall and replace it with a more Georgian-style tower with a clock on it, the one you see today. But that wasn't original to the building. That was added in the 1820s. But in the days when this was built, Independence Hall looked much different. And much of its original structure was destroyed. The buildings you see around Independence Hall today, the wings, are from 1898. They rebuilt them. They look old now, but they're not original. They were built in 1898. And the interior was kind of redone. They found a few pieces of wood, but the rest is all redone, to be honest. But sadly, we lost a lot of history in 1812, but we gained a lot by 1813, because a lot of the history, a lot of stuff dealing with the Revolution, a lot of stuff dealing with the War of 1812, a lot of stuff dealing with our founding fathers, who subscribed to this magazine, by the way. You had lots of people. One of the great people in Philadelphia at the time was Dr. Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry. And he was the fellow that put John Adams and Thomas Jefferson back together. And he was developing all different ways of working with the insane, as they called it at the time. And also was the first director, or one of the first directors, of the U.S. Mint. And unfortunately, he would die. But he was a subscriber. Many of our founding fathers used to read this. Many of them would write in with comments and complaints. And of course, Washington Irving did a lot of phenomenal work in doing the editing of this magazine. Eventually he would leave. Eventually Thomas be replaced by Maxwell. And the quality of the magazine changed because they'd be advertising for people to send in stories. And by the beginning of the 1820s, everything kind of changed for the magazine. But just think about that. 52 Chestnut Street. The daguerreotype at the beginning of this that you saw was looking at 46 to 52 Chestnut Street, right where these came from. And if you can think about this in closing, one of the most amazing things about these great and fascinating books is their history. And history never stops teaching us. And history never stops influencing us. And history never stops guiding us. All of these various points about history. I love this stuff. I read these things a lot because I'm always learning from them. Because they're chock full of information. And as soon as I think I've read everything, I discover I've missed a whole bunch. And so I have, as I said, 36 issues of this magazine. There's a lot of information there. And so if you do get the opportunity to get a copy or read about it or study it, do so. Because it was an influential and important part of the beginnings of the United States. And if you think about it, it was what? When they did the work in 1812, that was what, 36 years after the Declaration of Independence, 25 years after our Constitution, 9 years after the Louisiana Purchase. And if you think about it in that way, it was 23 years after the start of the new government under our present Constitution of 1789. Amazing when you think about it. And once again, grand and fascinating material. I hope you enjoyed this. I wanted to share this with you because I love this. I think you can tell that. And learn your history. We're going through rough periods of time here in this country. And one of the great deficits that we have is lacking an understanding of our history. Read, learn, study. And it helps a lot. So thank you, and have a great day.